Hi, everybody. Welcome to CMN 201. This is for our class for Wednesday, October 26th, where I wanted to talk about Psycho, which we saw last week, and also prepare us for our next film, Night of the Living Dead. And you can see how I've cheated with the decade of the 1960s and that I selected two films from the 1960s. Though my argument is that the 1960s were a particularly chaotic and tumultuous time, one of great change and revolution, so that perhaps justifies two films from the same decade. Because, as you know, I've been trying to have one film as a representation of each decade. And eventually, actually, we will be watching a film that is quite iconic to represent the 1970s, and that happens to be The Exorcist. And I mention this to you because if you are a fan of Halloween, and I suspect you might be if you are in this class, this Friday, October 28th, I'm going to be giving a presentation at the Lava Center, which is in downtown Greenfield, 324 Main Street, where I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Halloween, and we are also going to screen The Exorcist and have a discussion about it. So if you're looking for something to do for Halloween, or if you are wishing that we had an in-person opportunity to talk about some of these films, we've got the opportunity on Friday. So, and it's free to the public. So, at any rate, moving on to talking about Psycho, a very iconic film. As I had indicated, it was inspired by a novel by Robert Bloch, and so many of these films have been inspired by novels based on the Ed Gein murders, murders that involved cannibalism and great violence against female. And definitely, we saw violence against female in Psycho. And we will continue to see violence against female in other films such as Halloween. And in fact, Halloween and John Carpenter, highly influenced by Psycho. So knowing Psycho will help you understand what happens when we see Halloween. If you note the my notes below, you'll see that I've got some pictures from the film. The first is probably the central character in the film, which I would argue is the actual motel itself, the Bates Motel. And it looks quite gothic, very much in the gothic tradition. And you can see that we've got a modern version of the motel next to that iconic version in the back, that's always looming and that acts as our monstrosity. We see a lot of genre blending in this film. This film is as much a detective story as it is a thriller. Remember that Edgar Allan Poe was credited with creating the modern detective story, so that seems to make sense. And of course, Alfred Hitchcock is one of the first directors that led to the kind of deification of directors that we think of today. And Hitchcock has been called the father of modern horror film, and I think that that's an accurate title. Now, Hitchcock loved to put himself into his films. He would oftentimes do short cameos, and actually, he would always do short cameos. And 6 minutes into the film, and you can see that there, I have a picture below, we see an image of Hitchcock through a window. He's wearing a hat, a cowboy hat at that point. But I guess when you're the director, you can make decisions as to whether or not you are going to appear somewhere in your films. It was a small budget film, a commercial success. It was a marvel of marketing in many respects. One of the ways that they marketed this film is not allowing anybody to enter into the theater once it had begun, which led to wonderful word of mouth. What kind of film would this be that theaters would not allow you in once it had started? So it was a great way to generate buzz. And as you saw, this is very much a psychological horror film. I always thought of it as the psychological horror of an isolated family unit, or what happens during domestic seclusion, that the home is not a refuge, it becomes a kind of prison, as we see with Norman and his Bates Motel. And some have even argued that, again, the 1960s was the time not only of suburban white flight, or trying to find the home as a place of safety. And of course, we saw in something like Invasion of the Body Snatchers that the home in suburbia is not a place of safety. and that the television itself was a kind, and think about how the role of television was just gaining in prominence during this time period, that the television was basically replacing the former hearth that used to appear in the homestead, right down to the flickering images. It would take the central part of the living room. It was treated as a piece of furniture, and the entire family would sit around it. The film is definitely about the secrets behind closed doors. I had referenced something like this with Cat People as well, as that we see what's behind that brownstone. And that no place is safe, not just the suburbs, but the shower. Again, Psycho probably best known for that iconic shower scene. And you can see in the notes below that I've also got a picture from that shower scene. Of course, there were boycotts about it and threats of censorship, but one of the marvels of this scene is that we never see the knife actually penetrate the skin. We see knife, we see skin, and you can see in the picture below that the knife is touching the skin, but it never penetrates the skin. Your imagination is what fills in the rest, which is why Hitchcock is considered to be such a master. Rather than showing us the monstrosity, he suggests it. And I believe we talked about Stephen King a little bit at the beginning of the semester, and that from Stephen King's perspective, the most effective horror is that which suggests, doesn't directly show. Of course, this film upsets expectations in multiple ways. It's quite sexual for its time period. It also has us empathizing in the first part of the film with what is a thief. And then that seeming lead is killed. And oftentimes it's been discussed that this was a way for Hitchcock to deflect our attention. A MacGuffin is what it was called, is that he was trying to trick us or fool us. But I found a wonderful video online that talks a little bit about the female lead. It's 12 minutes long. You can see it in the notes below in the second section. Understanding Psycho, the uncanny. And we've talked a little bit about Freud's uncanny as well. That which seems to be like us, yet also different at the same time, and how disorienting that is. We've also talked about doppelganger and the idea of doubling that you will oftentimes see in horror film. So please watch this 12-minute examination of the use of the uncanny in Psycho, because you'll get a really good perspective of not just the uncanny, but how you can go about analyzing film. And their argument is that the lead isn't just put to distract us from the real issue. There are real reasons why that lead is there, but I don't want to give away too many spoilers, so I'll let you find out on your own. It's more than just a MacGuffin, according to this particular person. In Psycho, definitely we see how female is victimized and brutalized, and the anger and the hostility against female. Note all the bird imagery, and bird at the time was slang for female. Marion Crane, for instance, a crane is a bird. The references to her eating like a bird, all of the taxidermy of birds that we see Norman doing. The way that's a bit of foreshadowing of how he's going to taxidermy his mother, in effect. This is a film of voyeurism, and certainly we see how Norman is voyeur. But so are we as audience looking in on these intimate moments, whether it be a lover having illicit sex in a hotel room, whether it be someone taking a shower. So again, I think we could see this as a commentary for life in the 1960s and about the role of television and film, creating a kind of nation of voyeurs. Rather than us engaging in action, we're watching action. And as I had indicated, it helped to inspire John Carpenter's Halloween, which I'll talk a little bit more about when we get to Halloween. One of my favorite lines in Psycho, I honestly don't know why, but it always makes me laugh, no matter how many times I've seen this film, is the fruit cellar line, when Norman is bringing supposedly his mother down into the fruit cellar, and she objects, and she says, you must think I'm fruity. And for some reason, it always makes me laugh. Again, I don't know necessarily why, but do expect that Psycho is going to be one of these iconic films more than just from the horror perspective, but just in terms of cinema as a whole. Almost like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari with its experimentation with German expressionism. So, Night of the Living Dead, as I had indicated, is also a film that is representational of the 1960s. This time, the later 1960s as opposed to the earlier 1960s. And George Romero, the director of Night of the Living Dead, basically created or reinvented the idea of the zombie. Prior to this, the zombie was a Haitian idea about slavery, in effect, that through voodoo and perhaps also through some sort of medical intervention, someone could be manipulated into performing labor without having any kind of consciousness. In fact, there was a study done about this from a Harvard researcher called The Serpent and the Rainbow that you might be familiar with because it was made into a film. And the idea is that through the religious fears and beliefs of voodoo, and also through the toxins of probably the pufferfish and the psychological trauma associated with being buried alive, because basically what would happen is that through voodoo and this toxin, an individual would seem to be dead. All bodily functions would seem to stop, and then this individual would be buried, and then of course they would be resurrected, so to speak. They would be unburied, and then they would be used as slave labor. And so it's a great commentary on colonialism. It's also a great commentary on the Black experience, especially in the Caribbean. There's a film called White Zombie that's quite famous. In the 1930s, we know how iconic the 1930s are in terms of horror film, that talks about that. And in fact, it stars someone we've discussed, Bela Lugosi, who is the zombie guru, if you will, the zombie master who's manipulating people. But that's how zombie was thought of until George Romero came around and basically created this mythology that a zombie is a dead person that's reanimated back into life. We aren't necessarily given specific reasons why, and he created an industry out of it. And for better or for worse, it was because of a copyright error. So what ended up happening, he was an independent filmmaker and shot on a shoestring budget, and we'll talk about this with films such as the Blair Witch Project as well. He used black and white film because it was less expensive, and I'm so grateful that he did, because it really, from a cinematic perspective, it's quite beautifully shot in black and white. You get a lot of shadows, a lot of film noir sort of elements to it that would have been lost, I believe, in the color. When he did get enough funding to be able to switch it over to color, he just decided to remain with black and white, which was a very good call on his part, I believe. But as it was going through all of its edits, the last edit included the title, Night of the Living Dead, which had been changed several times, and someone somehow forgot to put the little copyright sign on that, which meant that the film was released into public domain. What that meant is that George Romero didn't earn profit from his film, and that film could be shown any place, anywhere without compensating him, which was horrible, but also wonderful, because that meant that this film spread like wildfire, so that ultimately on all kinds of late night television shows and Halloween festivals and all of the rest, Night of the Living Dead would be shown, which helped to bring about the common cultural understanding of zombie. Because if you ask somebody now what a zombie is, they probably will lay out several characteristics, even though a zombie is a fictional thing. So, Romero says that his film was a commentary, a direct commentary on revolution, and a film of the 1960s. And keep in mind another film in the 1960s that perhaps you're familiar with, Rosemary's Baby, which was the story of a woman who was giving birth to the Antichrist. There was this sense in 1966, for instance, because of the last three numbers of the year, 666, that this was the year of the devil. Also, we've got the Vietnam War, we've got social protests, we've got rampant drug use and abuse. So many people thought, in effect, that the world had gone to hell. And there's even a scene in Rosemary's Baby where she's reading a magazine cover, and it actually is a magazine cover from that time period that was suggesting or asking, is God dead? So that was sort of the temperament, the mood, the tone in the late 1960s. It was very apocalyptic. So as you are watching Night of the Living Dead, and because it does not have copyright, I'm able to very easily find a link for you, which you can see below. I chose a high definition link. The problem with Night of the Living Dead, because it was without copyright, is that people were using very poor prints, and you really want something that's sharp and crisp so that you can see the beauty of the filming when you're watching Night of the Living Dead. At the very beginning, you'll see a shot of an American flag. This will be important because this film is very much a commentary on America. There's also going to be a reference by one of the characters about a time change that's gone on. And this is Romero, the director, talking about how the times are changing, in effect. We see a world gone mad, which is something that we've seen in previous films thus far. And the fact that we ourselves are now the monsters. We can literally be turned into zombies. The idea of zombie, though, is something that perhaps Romero is best known for in his next film in his series of zombie films. And that was Dawn of the Dead, where we have individuals who are survivors who are basically using a shopping center, shopping mall, as their a base of security. And we see how the zombies that are trying to break into this mall are the former shoppers who would go there. And this idea that Romero is saying that as consumers, we act like zombies. And if you've ever seen some of those old films of the Black Friday hysteria, less so now, I think, because of online shopping, where literally, people could get crushed and gates would be broken and windows would be broken with people trying to get into a Black Friday sale, the sale after the day of Thanksgiving. Then perhaps we can see just how accurate Romero was in terms of his depiction of consumers. But at any rate, you can think of the zombies as the masses, the zombie hordes that are uprising. And we will also see the collapse of all of the institutions that we've taken comfort in. We'll see the collapse of the nuclear family in this film. We will see how young love is no way to defeat the zombies. We'll see the collapse of a sibling relationship. We'll basically see how the survivors have an inability to work together, and because of that, that's what leads to their destruction. And this is an old motif in zombie films, that the real monsters are us, not necessarily the zombies, because the zombies are mindless, but we have intellect, and yet we are unable to work together for the common good. Institutions of authority are also shown to be quite ineffective in Romero's films. Government, law enforcement, media, military, all of them can't be relied on during the sense of this moment, this seeming apocalyptic moment. Our lead, and this is also something that was revolutionary for this film, Ben is his name, is African American, which would be huge for the time period to have a lead as an African American and be cast as a hero. Again, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but this is one of the historical reasons why this film is so important. It's also a very self-referential film, so horror films have been out long enough so that they can begin basically making fun of their own tropes. At one point, we have the brother-sister duo at the beginning of the film, Johnny, say to his sister, Barbara, as he's trying to scare you, "They're coming to get you, Barbara." Very famous line from Night of the Living Dead and horror films in general. And the ending is quite dark and quite startling. Again, I don't want to give away any spoilers, so we can talk a little bit more about this next class. And do think about also how gender is portrayed in this particular film. So Night of the Living Dead is an hour and 35 minutes long. You will see that in the third section of our notes. I've got a link to YouTube for a high-def version of Night of the Living Dead, which I think is a particularly appropriate film to see now that we are on the cusp of Halloween. And again, if you are interested in doing something for Halloween on Friday, the 28th, I will basically be talking a little bit about The Exorcist, as well as talking a little bit about, ultimately, another film or Halloween and the history of Halloween. So what's left is basically our attendance question, and as you know, that's due on Friday, but certainly at 6 p.m. But certainly you can take additional time if necessary. Just ask me if you'd like. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.